Hello, everybody, and welcome to Steel Sharpens Steel. I'm Tom Cunningham. We're going to be jumping into a variety of topics to give you all the information that you need to dominate the conversation, whether it be at the spades table or chopping it up with your angry uncle who is sweating at the grill. With me, as always, is my partner, Chuck Hobbs.
Good afternoon.
And someone who has become a third wheel to Steel Sharpens Steel. This is her third appearance. From Thoughts and Moments, we have Joy Stevens.
Hello, everyone. This is what I do. I slowly work my way in to being a permanent host. It's just a matter of time.
So she's weaving she got her little finger things weaving through the gumbo. I know you're putting some extra okra in there, Joy. Thank you. Today, we have a variety of topics. And the first up in our headlines is the blistering article from The Atlantic, which is discussing the president's deplorable behavior and his disparagement of all things, World War I veterans when he was in France for the Memorial Day services. I was not surprised. I don't think anybody was really surprised that a sociopath has no understanding of why someone would want to do something for country as opposed for self. He famously chose not to go to Vietnam because of some mysterious bone spurs that have not prevented him from walking down the aisle at least 3 times in his subsequent marriages. Chuck, what are your feelings on this article, which was supported by 4 anonymous sources?
Tom, like you, we both grew up military brats. So, as you well know, my father served in the United States Army for over 20 years, a little over 20 years, retired as a lieutenant colonel in 1983. But as a captain from 1968 to 69, he was deployed to South Vietnam and served there for a little bit over a year as well. And it was something that Dad rarely talked about. You know, my father was not one of those gung-ho Captain America types that boasted and bragged about what may have transpired over there, but it was pretty clear that it was pretty bad, much of what he saw while there. And for the things that he did not actually ever really want to talk about, I've had that filled in by my mom. Dad died 20 years ago, but my mother has always been able to help me understand even better context-wise what it is that Dad saw and experienced while there. So suffice it to say, just like you and just like most Americans, I have a healthy dose of respect for the men and women who serve in the United States military. And I have an even higher degree of respect for those who actually serve during times of war, and even the highest respect for those who lose their lives in war. So like you say, I can't say that I was shocked by the comments. I know that there will be some who defend him, who will say, well, we don't know if that's true. He said today it wasn't true. But there are too many well-placed sources in the Atlantic article that would lead me to not want to think that this was something like some gossip rag like the Mirror out of London that was making the comments. That said, yes, I found it problematic that he called those who serve in the military losers and suckers. I find it to be more than problematic because he is the commander-in-chief of the United States Armed Forces. And one of the things that the Republican Party has prided itself on for the last 3 decades is being the party that is pro-military. Long before Donald Trump ever switched from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party had draped themselves in jingoism that was tinged with, we support the troops, we support the military. And so I find that problematic for him. The fact that the White House has spent all day today fighting back, that he has been tweeting left and right. I never said it. The fact that he has even tried to backtrack comments he made about John McCain. As you well know, as we all know, John McCain was shot down over Hanoi and spent about 5.5 years in the infamous Hanoi Hilton as a prisoner of war. And we know that there was no love lost between John McCain and Donald Trump. We also know that during the course of John McCain's life, there were times where Donald Trump called him a loser. We all remember the soundbite of, I like people who were not captured, that he made 5 or 6 years ago. And again, I just struggle with that. You know, it's okay that Donald Trump did not serve in the United States Army. I think we point that out to point out the hypocrisy of it. But I'm going to tell you something else, Tom. Once back in 1992, when I was talking to my dad, I was home from Morehouse working on a paper for my Asian history class, and it was centering upon the war in Vietnam. And when I was talking to Dad as a 20-year-old about, I said, well, Dad, how do you feel about Bill Clinton? Bill was running that year against George Herbert Walker Bush. And I just threw it out there because one of the talking points that year was, well, Bill Clinton dodged the draft. And Dad looked up at me, and again, he wasn't a gung-ho type of guy, but he said, Chuck, those were the times. He said there were a lot of men who did not fight. Not everybody wanted to participate and deal with it. And even as a veteran, he was like, I'm not going to cast aspersions at guys who did not fight. But him not casting aspersions is different from someone who did not fight, then later trying to not only cloak themselves in the patriotic rap, but also making comments like suckers and losers about those who, as Abraham Lincoln once said, gave the last full measure of devotion, which is losing their lives in service to America. So yes, he has a problem with that.
Well, at least he didn't kneel when the national anthem was being said. Joy, I want you to jump in on this. In particular, we have seen that the Republican Party is trying to circle the wagons on this and trying to protect him. Defense Secretary Mike Esper made mention of the fact that he has requested pay raises for the troops and has increased military spending. How does that square with the pretty obvious trend that Trump has expressed in terms of disrespecting actual members of the military service, up to and including the son of his soon-to-be then Chief of Staff, John Kelly, whose son died in Iraq and who he disparaged actually on Memorial Day in Arlington Cemetery?
I believe that the reason that they're circling the wagons like this is patriotism and the idea of being pro-America, being for your country. That is the last stronghold that they have with their base. Aside from just coming out and saying we're racist and we want to hold everybody down, they hold on to this idea of patriotism. Kneeling and protesting, et cetera, is un-American and against the flag. There's this famous picture of Trump hugging the flag, whatever. But at this moment, you can't hide this. He has said what he said, and it is what it is. And there's no spin on this that allows them to say, oh, he was just kidding. He didn't mean it. Because you never open your mouth as a patriot and disparage someone that has died for you to stand there and say what you say. You don't do it. It's different to say that there are systems in the country that need to be corrected, that there are discrepancies in representation, there's discrimination. Those are systemic problems. But no one who loves his country, really, really loves his country, is going to say the troops, anyone who ever died for this country is a loser. And I think that's what they're going to have to struggle with, because, again, going back to the idea of narcissism, he probably didn't even realize what he was saying, because that's just who he is. Sociopaths and psychopaths, they don't always have to be mass murderers. They just don't have any ability to understand someone else's emotions, their feelings, to have any sort of empathy for anyone else. And that's what we're dealing with here. That otherwise, why would you ever even say something like that? And they're going to be tap dancing around this for a minute, because, again, you've been talking a lot in this campaign around patriotism and loving the flag and support our troops. And then you turn around and call them losers. Even cognitive dissonance isn't going to get them past that.
Well, and some of the people who are not going to be able to tap dance around their emotions on this are the current members of the armed services who have just been notified that the Civil War era publication of Stars and Stripes, the official military outlet through which news is promulgated amongst the armed services, has mysteriously been withdrawn by the Pentagon. Now, we can't say for sure why this newspaper, which has been uninterrupted in its service since, the time of the Civil War, has been suddenly stopped. But it is interesting that there was an article recently that indicated that a majority of the currently serving armed service personnel oppose the Trump presidency. That's an interesting piece of information to try to process as we enter into the final 60 odd days of the presidential campaign, that in addition to calling Joe Biden a socialist and saying that socialist tactics and communist tactics are going to be employed. Apparently, censorship is not beyond the fascist actions of this president. Uh, I want to segue into some more topics that we're dealing with. So, why don't we jump on to something that's a little bit on the Democratic side of things? We found out just recently that Joe Biden and the DNC had a record-setting month of fundraising in August, raising some $364 million, which is quite a tidy sum for a campaign that is apparently suffering an enthusiasm gap. Joy, what do you think about the prospects and the enthusiasm of the Democratic electorate when we're seeing fundraising numbers like this, when I think by all measures, many people figured that Trump was going to be outspending the DNC and the Biden campaign by as much as 5-1 in certain markets?
Well, I mean, I had 5 on it as well. So I think even though there's a lot of people that are not, we'll say, overly enthusiastic about the ticket that's been put forth, there are also a lot of people that understand what's really at stake. This is not a popularity contest. This is really about how we want to be as a country going forward. Which type of American do you want to be? One that recognizes the value in all people, or one that just wins at all costs? And I think that's what people are coming to understand. And so, yeah, you may have people that don't necessarily talk about their politics, or they don't want to really get involved, or they don't want to be overtly supportive, but will still understand that that campaign needs money. And like I said, slip a little $5, $10, $15 to it. Remember, Obama had the same sort of grassroots, widespread support in that he got a lot of $5, $10, and $15 donations across the country. And I think you're seeing that happen again, although the companion rah-rah that you got from Obama, you don't have here, but the money's still coming in.
Well, I think a lot of that is true. The positive is that Biden doesn't have the negatives that Clinton had in 2016. He doesn't have that believability and trust gap that Clinton had, thanks to the persistent pounding of the emails, which, of course, it has just now been revealed that Melania Trump was using a private email service for her correspondence during Trump's first administration. Chuck, I wonder, there's been a lot of talk about shy Trump voters, that the polls are wrong because there are a lot of Trump voters who would not be willing to say that they're in support of Trump. That doesn't seem to track with me. I mean, we've seen women Trump supporters with shirts that say "grab me by the," with an arrow pointing down to that region. They're Virginias. And I wonder, do you think that these Trump voters are actually a factor? Is this something that is bubbling under the surface that we should be concerned about?
Tom, that's a really good question. And I actually do not think that that is as much an issue as is being made. I am almost a one-man wrecking crew with regards to saying I don't pay attention to polls. I mean, I do, because polls are fun. It's good to look and to see people, prognosticate what may or may not happen. But we all are old enough to have seen too many instances where the polls say X and the results equal Y. Again, I swore off polls back in 2016 because, as I have said time and again over the last 3 or 4 months, Hillary Clinton, by most objective indicators, was supposedly up by 12, 13 points over Donald Trump in October of 2016. And Donald Trump was able to win a pretty sizable electoral college victory. So with that in mind, I listen to them. I read them, of course, because, hey, the three of us were pundits, but I don't put much stock in that. I take it as this. I think that Donald Trump's core constituency will remain solid. I have no question about that. So the 63 million or so who voted for him in 2016, most, if not all of them, will vote for him again in 2016, this go around. What he was able to do in 2016, though, was he was able to siphon off quite a few people who would have maybe identified themselves as moderate independents, or if you want to even call them, dare I say, Obama Democrats, who, for the things that you mentioned, Tom, as well as Joy, that, Hillary had negatives. There were a lot of things about her that a lot of people just simply did not like, whether it was rooted in fact or whether it was rooted in just personal aversions to her personality, so to speak. There were some Democrats and some independents that just did not push the lever, who won't have that same specific issue with Joe Biden. So I'm optimistic that when I see the numbers, that there was a record-setting August for the Biden-Harris ticket as far as fundraising. I think that does bode well, because we know heading into late September and October, the person with the most money is the person who will flood the airwaves, and the person who floods the airwaves usually will, be able to siphon off some of those voters who may still be on the fence. But to take it in another direction, what I still remain concerned about, and I will talk about it today, I will talk about it over the next few weeks with both of you. I'm concerned about the on the fence Democrats, so to speak. I keep reading people who are like, well, I've got problems with Biden, or they raise issues about he doesn't seem like he, is all together mentally. I've read quite a bit of that on social media. I think that he hasn't answered for this, or he hasn't answered for that. And those are the ones where it's not as if they are going to go and run and blacken the oval, so to speak, for Donald Trump. But I'm concerned that by staying home, that is ostensibly a vote for Donald Trump as well. And those are the ones that I continue to try to communicate with the best I can in my punditry.
Yeah, I think one important issue for folks to realize is that even though Hillary Clinton was up in the polls all the way through to actual election day, there were many more undecideds still in play. So you had her up, but since there were, 7 to 8% of people undecided, when those people fall, then that is definitely more dispositive than when you have a much closer range now, where more of the electorate is allocated and kind of aligned with one or two parties, and there's probably not going to be as much drift. But I agree, Chuck, there's a lot at stake. And as one of our viewers, Kenya Jones, said, she was co-signing on something that Joy said. There's too much at stake. We have Supreme Court appointments, we have federal court appointments, we have a lot that is at stake in this election. So folks who would pretend that we can just blithely let a vote go, or a protest vote, for instance, for Gary Johnson, who got more than 100,000 votes across the entire electorate. We had Jill Stein, who was able to tip the scales actually in both Wisconsin and Michigan, resulting in critical Clinton losses in both of those states. We do have some good news across more of those bluish, purplish states, everywhere, surprisingly, except Pennsylvania, where you would almost certainly expect Biden to overperform since he has so many roots there. But he's actually doing a lot better in Wisconsin than he is in his own state of Pennsylvania, which is interesting because Trump has proposed a visit to Kenosha, and Biden has already said that he will meet with Jacob Blake's family, which refused a visit from Trump, saying that they did not want to be a part of a photo op. Joy, what do you think as far as how Wisconsin, and specifically the activism and protesting, which eventually resulted in violence in Kenosha, will play over the next several weeks? And how do you think that will impact overall in the election, which Trump has magically created to be a referendum on law and order in a country that is spinning out of control under his administration?
That's a really good question. And what I'm seeing, as I flip on a YouTube channel or go to Facebook or Twitter or whatever, the ads that I'm seeing are extremely, they're full of fear mongering. If Biden is elected, they're going to come in your house and beat you to death and take everything. Like, it's really visceral. And it feels like the boogeyman. It feels like they're telling you, if Biden gets elected, the purge is just a few days away. The way they've cut his words, etc. If I hadn't seen some of his original interviews and original speeches, I would be afraid too. But I did see those original speeches. So there's the other thing is, so many people, they're not watching they're not going to watch the debates. They didn't watch neither the DNC or the RNC, but those ads that flip through YouTube and Facebook, etc. Well, YouTube mostly, they're going to see that, and they make decisions based off those 30 seconds. And that's dangerous, because from my point of view, America, if you look at it as an organism, we're in a crisis. We are stressed out as a country. And when you have stressors, your sympathetic nervous system takes over and you've got fight, flight, or freeze. And so if you look at the people who are fighting to maintain the status quo, then you look at the rest of us who are, trying to flight against that. You've got this group of freeze. And that's what I'm seeing. That's what I think is so dangerous is it's not that they're going to vote one way or the other or vote for a third party. They're going to abstain. And we're going to lose a piece of the electorate that nobody gets because ultimately, and this is my opinion, I think there are a lot of folks that don't want 2021 to be their fault, no matter which way it flies. And so I'm just going to stay out of it. I don't know what to believe. I've heard it from so many people. And mind you, I'm moving in corporate spaces. The idea, the myth that there's this uneducated group that just is making bad decisions. These are executives, directors, managers, leaders that when I talk to them, the discussion is, I don't know what I believe in anymore. Even around like masking up and fighting the pandemic, the misinformation, the Orwellian-esque gaslighting that has gone on has served its purpose. And people are removing themselves from the process, which means if you take out numbers, then the percentages are much more affected by every single vote. So absolutely every vote is going to count this time.
Yeah, Tom, I wanted to jump in right quick as a follow-up to something that Joy said. As she is 100% right. We live in a time in which most people simply are not going to do the work. All right. So a meme here, catchy ad there is the best that so many millions of Americans, Democrats and Republicans, will be able to base their final decisions on. And I'm not trying to say that to be a jerk or to be an elitist. We had an interesting discussion in our Spelman, and I guess I am the Morehouse Man group last night about that whole issue. What I am concerned about, though, is that I don't want to see the narrative hijacked by the Trump administration with regards to law and order. I think that the more that the media in particular, and I'm not talking about Black media like ours or the smaller outlets, but so long as CNN, MSNBC, Fox continue to give credence to this Trump rallying law and order, it takes focus off of where Joe Biden and the Democratic Party and just anybody with any modicum of sense needs to be focused on right now, which is that 2020 or 2020 has been a nightmare, and it has been a nightmare because of COVID-19. Yes, President Trump stopped travel from China, but as we talk about almost ad nauseum on this show, it got into the United States because there was no stopping travel from Europe, and so we still had a problem. There should be almost a constant loop going with Biden commercials from here until November about this is a hoax, this is the Democratic hoax, this is the joke. They don't want to see your Donald Trump win. It's a conspiracy. They need to hit him hard with the fact that he was so blithe with regards to what was going on when the information was already out in February that we were about to hit an iceberg and that just like the Titanic, we were heading down. He didn't take it seriously, so much so that even last week during the RNC, or 2 weeks ago during the RNC, he had a 2,000-3,000 person event on the White House lawn, and there were maybe 5 people in the whole event that had on the mask to protect themselves. So we need to hit him with that. We need to hit him with the numbers economically with regards to how many Americans are out of work due to the fact that the administration did not do much with this pandemic. So the more he talks about law and order, and let's just cut through the chase, law and order is a euphemism for the Negroes. I mean, that's really where they're going with this. It's playing at white fears, because we all know if you're watching the footage that's coming out of Kenosha, if you're watching the footage out of Portland, those aren't Black people that are up there burning this or rioting that. It just isn't. But there are still so many Americans who are not paying close attention to it that they will listen to the sound bites of Black Lives Matter is a Marxist organization, Black Lives Matter is a terrorist organization, not understanding that that's not Black Lives Matter that's lighting up any of those cities. We just want the cops to stop killing us. We don't care about any of the rest of that stuff. And so with that in mind, I think that the more Joe Biden falls into that trap of letting Donald Trump set the narrative about law and order. And let's talk law and order. I mean, how many people in his own administration have been arrested, perp walked, and gone into federal prison based upon acts that they did? I mean, I'm sure, Tom, you might have the number, but it's way more than what happened under 8 years of Obama. So how law and order is he when you consider the fact that many of his cronies and underlings are already felons at this point?
Well, it's an important distinction to make as well, and it should not be lost on anyone, that Black Lives Matter protesters have not shot anyone.
Ever.
Police have shot people,
Mhm.
and people who are in support of police, particularly Kyle Rittenhouse, have
Mm.
shot 3 people. The police are continuing to shoot and kill people. We saw that finally, months and months and months later, that the cops are finally going to face some repercussions after having put Mr. Pruitt under a hood and causing his death. And you see the police unions who are saying, well, you know, we support Donald Trump because he's supporting us. But at the same time, those are the people who are inciting these events. There aren't Black Lives Matter protests that are resulting in the burning of buildings because of traffic stops where the people were taken to jail. But when you can see men running after other police with knives, when you can see men holding guns, when you can see white assailants who have murdered people and are gingerly treated, given water, put gently into handcuffs, their wounds tended to. And you see, on the other hand, Black folks, unarmed Black folks, are being shot or paralyzed and ultimately killed in many instances by these same state-sponsored actors. That is at the heart and soul of the unrest right now. And that is a part of Donald Trump's America, not a future dystopia under Joe Biden. And I think that's where the cognitive dissonance is. He's not really winning on law and order.
Mm.
He's bringing up law and order because he thinks it's a winner for him, because he thinks people are scared of it. But you've got, what, 4 cities where there's a lot of violence? There's protests in a lot of places. But currently, right now, you've got Portland. Kenosha has mostly died down. You've got some stuff going on to Chicago, but that's not the whole country. If you're sitting there in Alabama, or you're sitting there in Nevada or New York City, you're not seeing rampant violence. You can barely go out to get a hot dog. So it's interesting that he's trying to play this card when really law and order is not the most important element that people are looking at right now. And we were talking about how the ads and misinformation and who can run the most ads is going to be a factor as we enter into the final days of the campaign. Facebook has actually come out and said that they are not going to allow political advertisement in the week leading up to the election. Now, there's some wiggle room. We don't know if that's just new ad placements or existing ads that they have already had an opportunity to vet. But it is important to see that this time Facebook is recognizing the power that they wield in the space, and that they are not, in fact, going to allow themselves to be worked in such a way as to spread misinformation, whether it be from Russian bots or from the president. Given that the president has made several statements that have had to be taken off of social platforms, not only Twitter, but Facebook itself. While we're talking about the president and his tweets, there was an interesting tweet that came out this week from the president denying something that had not actually been accused. He posted some tweets about how somebody was saying that he had a bunch of mini strokes, but he definitely hasn't had any mini strokes because he didn't have any mini strokes, because he didn't have any mini strokes. And the interesting thing is that most people believe this was predicated on an article that did come out that said there was an incident late last year in which Vice President Pence was asked to be on deck because there was a possible procedure that would cause Trump to be anesthetized. And during that period of time, Pence would have to assume control because Trump would actually not have his faculties about him. And he came out talking about mini strokes, which nobody else was talking about. And then curiously, he made a huge deal about a cognitive test, which showed how sharp he was because he was able to say person, woman, man, camera, TV. But he didn't have many strokes. Joy, you look like you're champing at the bit. Jump in on this, sister, and tell me what you feel about President definitely not had a mini stroke.
I had two thoughts about it. One is Shakespeare, methinks he doth protest too much. It reminds me of, the idea that I'm going to make sure nobody believes this. So I'm going to shout from the mountaintops that this isn't true because it's true. And if I say it hard enough, people will believe me. It also reminds me of the 5-year-old who gets caught in the kitchen eating snacks before dinner, and you walk in the kitchen and they got crumbs all over their mouth, and the first thing they say is, "I didn't eat cookies."
No cookies for me.
All up in here.
Cookies for you.
So once again, it reminds me of Hamilton. If you're familiar with the history, but also the play, Hamilton came out to expose his affair in order to deny embezzlement or mishandling of money that only a couple of people had ever said anything about. And so that vehement denial caused a whole lot of other problems for him and his wife and his family, etc. When, bro, wasn't nobody even talking about you though? Like nobody's even talking about this. So why are you making such a big deal out of it? So history repeats itself. Before I give up the mic, I want to go back to one thing around Black Lives Matter being a terrorist organization, et cetera, et cetera. Also, this idea that Antifa is another such terrorist organization. If you don't know, Antifa is short for anti-fascism. And so when you say Antifa is un-American, you're saying that anti-fascism is un-American. And so you're supporting a fascist America. Like, I need you to play that all the way out. But this isn't the first time that they've taken people who are allies to marginalized groups and turned them into something bad. Back in the summer of '69, the summer of love or whatever, the people who came out against the Vietnam War were largely young, and they were activists, and they also were allies to the Black communities. And so all of a sudden, I want to say it was Nixon, I could be wrong, but all of a sudden the presidency is putting out propaganda that not only are the Black Panthers a terrorist organization, but that all of the people who are allies to them, who are in the majority, are hippies and drug addicts, and the recriminalization or the criminalization of marijuana use. They're all just a bunch of tree hugging hippies out there, and they're coming to spread drugs in your community, et cetera, et cetera. So they demonize not only the Black group that was trying to go for independence, again, as a response to police brutality, but they went and criminalized their own group of young activists. And we are seeing the same thing again now. So history repeats itself, and law and order was brought up then, just as it's being done today.
Absolutely, Joy. And one of the things, and it definitely was Nixon, and one of the things that I find problematic is, again, the smearing of peaceful protest with whatever violence there may be. I posted a meme the other day because, again, we have to do that sometimes too. We can't always do 1,500 words and pull out our SAT words like we all have the capability of doing. Sometimes you have to throw a picture up to make it plain. And one of the things that I showed is, when you're talking about property, when you're talking about looting, let's not go there. The United States government was founded on looting human capital from Africa. European states, as well as the United States, made a killing off of diamonds, gold, ivory tusk, you name it. Europeans and their descendants here in the Americas were the original looters. And so I find it quite disingenuous when you realize that the entire American economy, the way we were able to become on par with European powers as early as the early 20th century was because of slavery, and then Jim Crow and King Cotton, and the fact that those were enslaved Black people or our Jim Crow sharecropping ancestors that were making white people very wealthy and making the American economy very healthy and robust. So I shake my head when folks want to start talking this looting stuff. I mean, don't get me wrong. I have sympathy for the shop owner here, the business owner there, who might have their businesses burned out. But let's be real. Everybody who has owned a business or a home, you have insurance. And if you don't have adequate insurance to cover it, there are going to be ways, especially nowadays, where you can get you a GoFundMe account going, and that store and or that home, it's going to get rebuilt. but you cannot rebuild a human being. The only person that, you know, many of us believe ever died and came back was Jesus Christ. So when the police have shot and killed another black man, woman, or child, my question is, where's the outrage on that? And Tom, I wanted to, you know, we talked about this a little bit earlier in the hour. When you consider that President Trump is on his way, or was on his way to Kenosha, and while going to Kenosha, it was, I support law enforcement, I support the blue. He's been pushing this narrative that law enforcement is under attack, they can't do their jobs right. What I want to see this president do, whether he has only 60 some odd days left in office or whether he gets another term, is to understand that we are all Americans. We are all taxpayers. And at the end of the day, he should be equally outraged that an unarmed citizen has been killed as he is when anyone else is killed or harmed out here. And that is the problem that I have, not just with Mr. Trump, but with many of our Republican friends who will post all of this. What about Chicago? And I'm like, well, what about Kenosha? What about George Floyd? What about Ahmaud Arbery? They don't ever want to talk about that, because at the end of the day, there are a lot of our white brothers and sisters in this country who don't want to reconcile the fact that their ancestors were looters and murderers and rapists. That's the first thing that they don't want to do. And number two, they don't want to reconcile the fact that they have that same mindset when it comes to us. They don't post about it. They don't talk about it because they don't care. It doesn't impact them when one of us is concerned about cranking up the whip and whether you're going to be an improper lane change away from being the next hashtag. They don't care because they don't have those same issues with law enforcement. And when I say they, I'm not talking all whites. We have a lot of white allies who are out here standing in the breach, who write, they preach, they type, they do everything they can do to raise awareness among their own fellow whites. But there are a whole other set who try to pretend as if none of this is true. And even worse, many of their black friends who, you know, the Uncle Ruckuses and the Aunt Rakishas who simply are
diamonds.
Yeah, exactly. The diamonds and the silks, they are truly problematic.
Well, and I think it's important at this point to say that law enforcement doing their jobs means abiding by the law, and it is not anyone's job to kill an unarmed suspect. That's not a part of the job description. You're not supposed to be killing suspects. You're supposed to be apprehending suspects and processing them through the proper channels. And when you go to the streets and kill someone without any sort of provocation, then that's not doing your job. And for all of the cops to fall in line and pretend that, oh, well, we can't use an illegal chokehold because of George Floyd. Well, if it's an illegal chokehold, it's
Why are
not
you?
doing your job.
Right.
So that's one of the things that I found interesting. And you mentioned Kenosha again, and I wanted to hop in with this tweet. Now, we talked about Kyle Rittenhouse briefly, and his lawyer fired off this tweet. Now, I have to tell you, this man's Twitter handle is at Cali Kid JMP. This is Kyle Rittenhouse's lawyer, John Pierce. Kyle Rittenhouse will go down in American history alongside that brave unknown patriot at Lexington Green who fired the shot heard round the world on April 19th, 1775. A second American revolution against tyranny has begun. And on the face of it, there's so many problems just with him equating those two, but not the least of which is that Rittenhouse was not waging war against a tyrannical government. He was waging war against citizens who were protesting the tyranny of the government. So even that tweet on its own is ridiculous. And there are a bunch of issues that may tie into how this guy was even retained. And, Kyle's father is dead and his mom is a single mother, and the single mother actually is complicit in his crime. And so there are a bunch of different issues surrounding whether or not she is able to even provide proper context for his care as a custodial parent, given her involvement in his unique circumstances. But it is important to note that there are a lot of things going on in this country that are happening under the aegis of this president that he is attempting to skirt responsibility for, and not the least of which of those is his most recent calls for citizens to vote twice. Joy, I saw you mouthing out those words as I was saying this, so I'm gonna let you take lead on this. Talk to me about the voter fraud president inciting his followers to participate in felony voter fraud.
So I live in Atlanta, Georgia. And I and a lot of people that I run with, we've all done a lot of work trying to help people get reinstated. Over 300,000 people were purged from the polls here in the state of Georgia. And it's been discovered that over 200,000 of those were erroneous, purged for no reason. The track of how they got kicked from the roll is a little nebulous. And of course, it's interesting that the Secretary of State that did all this is now the governor and was in charge of his own election. That's a whole nother story. But we have never in the history of mail had a problem with mail-in ballots. That has never been where voter fraud has taken place. And so the idea of, well, let's prove that voter fraud is or isn't there by voting twice, you're encouraging illegal activity. You're encouraging a complete undermining of the democratic process just to prove a point, just to try to win. Because of course, if there is a problem in the balloting, if there is a crack in the dam, so to speak, then now you've got illegal ballots. It invalidates the entire election. And I can foresee if people take him up on it, and people were drinking bleach. So there's a very good chance that people will take him up on this idea of voting twice by mail, if they even can pull it off. Then all of a sudden the election in November is invalid and he remains in power. And then all bets are off. There's not going to be a re-election. There's not going to be a second vote. They're never going to get that together because it's unprecedented. And this is how our democracy ends. It is just that serious. It is just that much on the line. It's not about, oh, well, we went through 8 years of Obama. You can go through 8 years of Trump. No, you can't. You absolutely can't. And for people that cannot see the beginnings of a fascist dictator, similar to ones we've seen in Germany in years past, if you can't see that parallel, it's because you don't want to. It's because in your way of thinking, whatever's happening now is in your best interest. And so you ignore any information to the contrary in order to maintain that core belief, whatever it is, that you're better, that you're superior, that this guy is going to somehow make you money. The belief that a lot of people have that they are even in the top 1%. If you work for anybody and somebody else pays you, you are not in that 1% of people that Biden is recommended to have taxed in order to equal things out in the United States. But again, back to the voter fraud, he's creating a problem that is either going to work in his favor or be something that he can say he solved when it was never a problem in the first place. And it's extremely, extremely dangerous. Again, we are in a battle for the soul of this country.
We did see already some election officials in at least 2 states say, don't do this. Please don't do this. There are mechanisms in place for people to verify whether or not their ballot has been received. So when you send it in, you have to send it in a certain way. When it is received, it's tabulated. There are websites, there are all sorts of things. They are explicitly saying, if you have voted and you voted in a timely fashion by mail, you coming to an election polling site to attempt to vote is only going to make in-person voting more difficult. And he had his Attorney General, William Barr, go out on television and make a wildly irresponsible and erroneous statement about 1,700 cases in Florida, which the DOJ had to walk back. And in fact, the AG and Deputy AG in Texas had to say, not only is this wrong, you didn't even call us to ask, because we could have let you know what the real deal was. But instead, to promote this agenda of potential voter fraud, you jumped into the breach and just decided you were just going to say something. And now it's embarrassing to you because it had to be corrected. In this final segment, I would like to transition into something that I think all of us, including our audience, would much rather talk about. And this is the most satisfying television program on television at the moment to me. If you are not watching HBO's Lovecraft Country, I don't know what you were doing on Sunday, because that is one heck of a show. And for those of you who aren't familiar at all with the premise, this takes place in 1950s America. We have Atticus, who has just come back from fighting in the Korean War. He comes back to find that his father has mysteriously disappeared. And Letitia, who is a family friend from way back, has just reemerged back onto the scene, having missed her mother's funeral. And she's back and she needs money. And her sister is not feeling her. And she's not happy that she's back. And they end up on a road trip, which, to say the very least, ends up with quite some interesting circumstances. Not the least which was an amazing visit to a diner, which resulted in Letty screaming like a banshee coming out of the diner to preface an amazing road trip and a lot of stuff going on. Joy, without getting into spoilers per se, talk to me about what your impressions were from this last week's episode, which actually touched on a couple of historical references that might have slipped through the cracks for people who were not well aware.
How you gonna do me like this and tell me not to do spoilers? I was ready to talk, and now I'm like, wait, can I say this? Okay,
You know
so
what? I'm freeing you. If they have not watched it, it's already been 5 days. The next episode's about to come in 2 days. Go on ahead, girl. Say what you want.
thank you. Okay, so this past episode was everything, and I love there was so much going on in the show. And if you're watching Lovecraft Country, I need you to have a notebook, pen, and paper by you. Take notes. Google things you don't understand. Go to Twitter because Twitter is breaking down a lot of the imagery, a lot of the clues, a lot of the Easter eggs that are happening in the show. I was watching it and I watched it twice. I don't even like scary shows. And I watched this episode twice because I had to go back and catch all the things I missed. There's all these cameo appearances by people who are playing famous characters like James Baldwin. There's a cameo of Emmett Till. And I mean, if you don't see it, you won't see it.
They even matched Emmett's tie,
Mhm.
which freaked me out when I saw the pictures together. I was like,
Mhm.
go ahead, Joy.
And so here's the other thing. So I do a lot of classes on like the historical impact of European colonialism on today's society and why it's important to have allies in the white community. So that's like my biggest class that I teach. And in it, I talk about the fact that in the history books that we use in the United States, we go from slavery to Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks, and there's almost nothing in between. And this show talks about a lot of what life was like for Black people in the 90 years between Reconstruction and the Civil Rights Movement. And so it fills in the gaps with truth. Yes, there are monsters. Yes, there's magic and wizardry and all kind of crazy. But if you take away the fantasy of it, it's a lot of realism in this show. I love the use of Gordon Parks images throughout. And then remember, this show was filmed a while ago, and the fact that we had this whole discussion across the country on Aunt Jemima and taking away, racist stereotypes, etc. And then to see that big Aunt Jemima sign in there, it was like they were prophetic as to how important that was going to be in today. You know what? I'm gonna turn the mic over because I could talk about this forever. If you're not watching the show, you're doing life wrong. And I need all of our white allies. If you really want to understand a day in the life before the civil rights movement before the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was signed, then I want you to watch this show. I want you to take notes. I want you to go to Google. I want you to do some research and really dig into what life was like so you understand why we think Black lives have never mattered in this country. Because this show is showing you that Black lives have never mattered in this country. And if you can get to seeing these people, these characters as humans and not just something that happened to people a long time ago that you don't have to worry about, then I think it can help you understand why we can't wait for justice to happen now, why we're protesting in the streets. It's all part of a piece of the fabric of this country. It's the best show on television. Jordan Peele is a genius. The writers are geniuses. I can't say enough. I hope it wins all the awards.
Yeah, I know, Chuck. I'm going to let you jump in because I know that you have a lot to say as well. One of the things that I really enjoyed about the show is that undergirding part of at least the first 2-3 episodes is the fact that George and Hippolyta, some people would pronounce it Hippolyta, but they actually were producers of the Green Book. And the journey that they take in episodes 1 and 2 was at least partially predicated on him trying to get the next edition of the Green Book out. So, unlike the movie titled Green Book, which was execrable, this one actually shows what the Green Book was actually about. And I'm going to turn it over to you, Chuck.
Yeah, this show has hit me powerfully. One of the things, we're all lovers of history. Everybody knows that I'm a huge lover and writer of American history, particularly American Black history. And I think that the ability to combine the wizardry, the fantasy element with real Black history and or fictionalized accounts of real Black history is so important. What I take away from each episode, many of these things, as we all are talking about, we know. Black people know about Emmett Till. Black people know about the Green Book. Black people know about what Jim Crow was, what Jim Crow was not, because either we've lived it or our parents and grandparents did, and those oral histories have been passed on to us so that we understand exactly how horrific things were. But what sticks out to me with this particular show is that when you look at how bad the monsters and the wizardry might be, how scary the ghosts are, you realize that the white supremacy racism aspect is even scarier. You realize that much is set in the city of Chicago. So often people talk about racism down in Dixie. We all know how bad it was down here in the Jim Crow South, but a lot of people don't like to talk about how very bad it was up in Chicago, how bad it was in Boston, how bad it was in New York, and not just was, how bad it is. And so I find it extremely fascinating to be able to, again, take a look at it from a fictionalized account and realize that in many ways, where we were, we still are. So, for example, when we are on here as a group and we're talking about voter suppression, right? We realize that there's nothing new under the sun. There are times, not only are we seeing it on this particular television show, but when we just look through pictures or we look at posts, you realize that in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, our parents and grandparents were struggling for and pushing for the exact same things that we find ourselves pushing for at this very minute. The other week I had a chance to talk to the legendary Jim Clyburn, and it broke my heart some. Not too tough because I've already heard this a lot from older family members of mine, but you realize that they are now in their 70s and 80s and they're recognizing, boy, how much has really changed. And so, again, I'm looking forward to seeing what the future episodes will hold. I've always been a big Game of Thrones fan. Tom, you were too. I love True Blood. Loved Watchmen last year. So this is right up our alley, to tell you the truth, and even more so because you're dealing with the historical bent. Tom, I know we're going to run short on time, but I also wanted to make one quick comment about that voter suppression piece, which is it bothers me to think that, again, the president of the United States, who is sworn to uphold the Constitution, one who is making a big production out of Law and Order right now, got on the mic this week and made a comment about wanting people to vote twice. And I think it segues also into this last segment we're in, because one of the worst parts of Jim Crow South and Midwest was the inability for our parents and grandparents in particular to actually vote. The fact that votes were not counted, ballots wound up missing. People were lynched when they went to try to vote. I think about your granddad, Tom, white folks, and all of those guys over in Texas, and can't imagine the type of courage it took to say, you know what, we're still going to register folks to vote. And so the courage that your grandfather and those had, and that our grandparents, Joy, had in terms of just facing day-to-day basic racism, not anything that's wildly over the top. I mean, just every day, this is what it was. You see that here in Lovecraft Country. And even though it provides us an hour respite from what we deal with on a day-to-day basis, we have to get out of that hour and then resign ourselves to making sure that we continue to push back and what have you against Jim Crow 2.0, which is trying to take root in the United States at this very moment.
Well, you brought up a very interesting point about perceptions of the South versus the North and the Midwest. And I'm listening to a podcast now, Nice White People, from the creators of Serial. And one of the points that it brings up very early, and it's a persistent thread that runs the entire run of the show, is that the New York public schooling system is the most segregated schooling system today in the history of the country. And famously, Lorraine Hansberry wrote an entire play, A Raisin in the Sun, about Chicago housing segregation and the efforts of a Black family to move themselves from a place of economic hardship into a place where they could have a garden and where their mother could do the sorts of things that she's always wanted to be, Mrs. Miniver. And here you have the same sorts of things, literally people across the street pounding "this is a white neighborhood" signs into their lawns, and having smug, cretinous folks put bricks on the handles of their horns so that the horns are constantly. And I said, wow, they must have really had good batteries back then, because like 8 days of persistent horns and them things was still sounding off. But
Yeah.
I will say this, one of the most revelatory things about this series is Ms. Journey Smollett. Now, I don't know if she was trying to make up for all of Jussie Smouillet's foolishness, and she's trying to reclaim the mantle of their family name, but Sister Girl is acting every single week. She is taking you through it, from the scene where she says, "We got to get the F out of here," and firing up that thing, to where she ran through the forest when those things were about to try to eat her. And when she came out this week and took that baseball bat to those 3 cars, and I mean, and then found all the ghosts. It was everything. She is all the Emmys, every single Emmy, Golden Globes, whatever. She is emerging, and she did a great job on Underground, which criminally was canceled way too soon. But Journey Smollett is proving herself to be, I mean, probably what, the new Angela Bassett, kind of like. She's that woman. She is really killing it. And just the layers of her character, where you think you know something about her because she's been kind of a little of a vampy, kind of sexy torch singer sort of persona. And then, and Joy wants to jump in. I'm gonna let you, because this is a woman thing. Go on ahead. Do it.
Thank you, sir. So I do want to talk about that scene. And again, if you haven't seen it, you need to stop listening right now. You got 3, 2, 1. Okay, so the scene where she is in the restroom. So again, we have all this imagery from things in the past, that her dancing on the dance floor with the guy who's like kissing her neck. And yes, she's trying to make Atticus a little bit jealous, but that's Carmen Jones right there. The guy kissing her on her neck, that same idea, vamp and everything. And we have this idea that she's worldly and she's done all this stuff. And so along with it, when you're a woman and you have lived things in the world, there is an assumption about the other things that you have done. So Atticus comes to her, they get it on in the restroom, and it's just sex, to Atticus. But we find out later, this is her first time. I knew it. As soon as I saw what happened immediately after, I knew exactly what had gone on. And again, it gives lie to the idea that Black women are promiscuous. Just because you don't have a husband, just because you live your life on your own terms, you must be some sort of whore. She is absolutely not. And again, in that moment, they've been through so much. And she said, I just wanted to feel something. I understood that. I also understood how many women have gone into their first time hoping for it to be something special and being woefully disappointed. I'm not talking about 2 Minute Brothers. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about thinking it's going to be this special moment and discovering that it's just another 5 minutes. He even walked out. Hey, no big deal, right? Okay, I see you downstairs. And her life is forever changed. She's crying alone in the bathroom. That hit me so hard, and I really love what they're doing with her character. I love the fact that she is everything I've ever yelled at a screen in a horror show. Like, you need to get the H up out of there. I don't know why he's still sitting there.
No, wait. When the ghost said, "Get out of my house," and blew her back into the stairs, I was like, yeah, I'm done. And if I had seen Sister Girl with no mouth grab the sheet off of me, I'm sorry, that would have been a short episode
I don't
because
think she saw her, but the minute I saw that all the lines in the pictures made a face, deuces.
yeah, no, it was a
Yeah,
lot. And I
yeah.
know you weren't talking about a 2 Minute Brother, but you weren't not talking about the 2 Minute Brother either. And in his defense, I will have to say that to me, his response to her in the aftermath of their mingling
Mm-hmm.
had a lot more to do with his damage. We've seen just the beginnings of that with what happened to him in Korea.
Hmm.
And when he returned to her and she was looking all frazzled and frantic because she had just spent the last 24 hours trying to figure out where all the ghosts were and everything. And she's sitting in the diner looking like a crazy person. As soon as he saw her, he was like, tell me about it.
Mm-hmm.
What's going on? So I agree. In the moment, he was not appropriate. He was like, pull up my drawers, get my belt buckled, and I'm
Well,
about to dip. But the connection between them is still so present. And when he realized what he had done, take it, Chuck. Go ahead.
Yeah, and Joy, just real briefly, one of the other things that was problematic for me in that particular episode, in that particular scene, was Atticus was somewhat, propelled by the lie that his buddy had told him as he stood
Mhm.
there watching the Carmen Jones-ish dance scene. The guy, yeah, me and Letty used to wrestle back in the day. How many times when we were growing up, either in high school, college, or hell, even at the frat house, sometimes dudes lie. A lot of times dudes lie. They lie on conquest, who it is they've dated, who it is that they've been with. And the next thing you know, you've got some guy having, feeling some kind of way about the woman. And yet after it was all over and they sat down at that diner, I really liked what he said without saying a word. Once she indicated that this was my first time, you could tell that there was some remorse, but I also sensed that there was a depth of concern for her, because had he known that this was basically her first experience with lovemaking or whatever, it might have gone down a whole different way. And so,
Go ahead, take us out, Joy, because we are right at the hour mark,
okay.
and we don't want to belabor the point. Everybody, you should be watching Lovecraft Country. It is an absolutely amazing show. But Joy, you wanted to jump in, so I want to definitely give you the opportunity to offer your final comments.
I was going to say some of the things that Chuck said, but I wanted to say, let's remember that Atticus is not a bad guy. He's not a manipulator. He's not a womanizer or a user. But because of the way she is in society, there was a foregone conclusion that she was possibly more sexually adventurous or experienced than he was. It never occurred to him to ask or to think of it because, well, she's out here dancing. And how many times if you think about the history of Black women in this country, the idea of that mother whore mentality, that you got to dress this way or you a hoe and blah blah blah, just on sight. And I'm not saying he was wrong. I'm saying, again, just like we say for a lot of white people who are learning new things, he was a product of his environment. She must be this way because look at her. She's pretty, she's dancing, she's flirting. She must be this way. Clearly she's had it before. And I do like the fact that once he discovered that wasn't the case, he didn't make any excuses. He didn't say, why didn't you tell me, and put the blame back on her. He was just there for her. And like Chuck said, in a silent moment of understanding. And that meant a lot. The fact that she said, my house is haunted. And he said, break it down for me. Like, there was no lack of belief in her. And as we all know, when we talk about sharing our stories with other people, having our identities and our realities be questioned, when you tell somebody something and they just believe you, that is bond in and of itself. And I'm looking forward to the rest of this show. I cannot wait for the next episode.
Well, before we close, there is some breaking news that literally just popped up on my screen about the Curtis Flowers case. For those of you who may not be familiar, Curtis Flowers was a Black man who has been tried 6 times in Mississippi for 4 murders. The district attorney has exercised horrible discretion in terms of retrying this man, and again and again and again. Finally, the Supreme Court last year overturned his final conviction, which threw the entire question of whether or not he would be tried again into question. It has just now been released that they are not going to be seeking additional charges against him. He is no longer facing another prosecution. And so Curtis Flowers is finally free. Whether or not he will return to Winona, which is highly unlikely given the circumstances and the tensions that still exist there after so many years He was not able to attend his father's funeral. He was not able to spend time with family all these many years. And of course, the family of those who were slain have been denied justice because this one prosecutor kept pushing this false narrative. But good, outstanding news for Curtis Flowers and his family. And with that, that's the last thing you should be talking about at the cookout. I see your uncle. He's got his slides and his shorts on and his big pig apron, and he's got them tongs, and he's flipping ribs. So you can tell him that you heard everything that you needed to talk about at the spades table, at the grill, or at Slapping Bones with Steel Sharpens Steel. I am Tom Cunningham.
And I am Chuck Hobbs.
And I'm Joy Stevens.
And we thank you for joining us. You guys be safe, wear masks, be socially distant, and enjoy whatever beverage of your choice this Labor Day weekend. Rest from your labors, people. You all deserve it. And thank you for joining us.